Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who track the slow motion collapse of their bodies like it's a spectator sport and yet still prefer it to the endless tedium of living forever. We just read 5 stories about immortality, and my goodness, we are here to tell you all about it. I'm Zach, and I'm really interested in exploring just this idea that we ran into again and again about how living forever, actual immortality, is hell. It's just truly hell on earth.
Welcome to hell, Zach. I'm Bob. I'm here to say Zach and I have found out how to be immortal. We're going to explain it to you at the end of the episode. I thought immortality was a wild ride because I'm in it right now. I think when we were reading these books, we were really hoping for, I guess, just any perspective into immortality. And we got that because each book looked at it very differently or used it not just as a trope of these characters happen to live forever. Each author was extremely interested in something completely different. Sometimes they would pick up similar threads, but it felt like each one that we read just didn't care at all about what anyone else wrote about immortality and just explored whatever they wanted to.
And, you know, it's interesting because we read SF books about immortality, but I think that like immortality is one of those unique concepts where it's both science fiction and it's fantasy and myth in this weird way.
In reality,
it's kind of like a timeless obsession of humanity. Ever since we figured out that we were mortal. Oh my God, does it go back to Adam and Eve? I mean, they eat the apple and learn of their own deaths. My God, making connections here. Okay, but my point being is that there's something about immortality that seems to be like the spurning of so many like quests, so many mythic knights quests. And yet even today, there are people who are chasing immortality, whether that is, you know, someone who's trying to create immortality through the art that they're making, or like, you know, a tech billionaire like Brian Johnson who wants to live forever by, you know, eating the right combination of vitamins. And my point being is that there's something technological about it, and yet there's something archetypical about it. And I think that's what made reading about immortality feel like it was peering into history and the past of literature, and yet also comfortably science fiction.
I think the first one I really want to look at and kind of think about reminds me of what Brian Johnson is trying to do, because this one was about the thirst for life and the absolute refusal to die. Now we have 4 young men who are 19 and a half, 20. This is the Book of Skulls by Robert Silverberg. And what we found was that it's just the true like lust for life, but also a deep fear of dying, a deep fear of no longer existing. So in this one, it's not really even, because we never find out like how long these guys are going to live. We don't know if it's a whole spoof or what, but we see the desperation in people to never die. Like we see how far people are willing to go. And it's nuts because these are 4 friends, they're roommates, and they know right from the beginning, okay, 2 of us are going to die. You know, we are going in this together, but we will kill 2 of us by making this decision. And it is worth it. And they all agree that it's worth it to never, I mean, it doesn't even make sense to never die, right? It's a complete contradiction. To never die, they will make sure that 2 of them die.
The idea that I really enjoyed about that is these questions of like, okay, what is the price of immortality? Can you ever trade, you know, a life for immortality? One of the characters in that book says that immortality feels like the defiance of a cosmic debt, in the sense that, you know, each of us when we're born, we automatically owe God one death. So in a sense, the urge to live forever, the urge to extend your life, the urge to overcome death is in a very real sense like blasphemous in this way, because it's cheating God out of what God is due. What a brilliant idea. I was really tickled by that.
So beyond the desperation of trying to live forever and trying to avoid death, I think Boat of a Million Years by Paul Anderson was really interesting, because there it's not a fear of dying and this promise that everlasting life gives of I will exist forever. But it's an experiment of what happens when an actual personality goes on really, really long, you know, thousands of years. And he brings up really great questions. We didn't necessarily like the style. However, I still think about this book a lot. Some of the questions are, okay, what experiences for you will be formative? And when you start to forget yourself, when when do you become a new person? Like what is the threshold from this was me and now so much time has gone by, I am no longer that person at all. But what you noticed when we did that video was when we did that, we read Paul Anderson's Boat of a Million Years, what you found was some of these characters just get stuck and they become completely defined by a stereotype, or they become so crystallized by one experience. Even 3,000 years later, they're still that person. They almost become
almost like a caricature of themselves at a certain time or place. I think that what this book did actually was give me a little bit of anxiety, and I can't tell if it's a product of just the writerly craft or whether he's actually making like a very astute observation about the human lifespan, the human soul, I dare say, in that these characters, they change, they develop, but then they kind of, like you said, get stuck as a certain person that they continue to be for the rest of their lives. I think that we can all think of people in our lives who maybe we could say like they peaked in high school or something. You know what I mean? Someone who was this and then they never managed to get to the next level of what it means to be a human. They never grew up. Maybe they're it's like a Peter Pan thing or Young's puer aeternus or something like that. But I think the hope that we would all have in living forever is that, moving from place to place, talking to person, reading book to book, our soul grows and we as an individual become someone new every year, every 100 years. The idea that I'm the same person as I was 5 years ago is ludicrous. So I would hope that if I managed to live 500 more years, I would be a new person 100 times over. And yet what we saw in Paul Anderson's Boat of a Million Years is that people they literally glitch into these personalities and can't move. They become stuck in it. And that's not even part of the plot. You know what I mean? That's not like the point of the book, but it is a side effect of living forever that I thought was deeply disturbing in some ways.
Missing no infinity. On the other side, I felt like it's a fetish. I feel like this obsession with immortality, not just to not die, but to become what I was thinking of as like a zenith point. I have become so wise after 2,000 years. I know everything. I am now the Buddha. I've reached nirvana and I've reached this ultimate point of humanity. And I feel like that is often why this gets into science fiction, is this fetish not just for never dying and for living forever, but for being a container of history for so long that you not just understand it, but you represent that huge line of humanity. You are not just, you're Methuselah, but you're Methuselah for like 2,000 years, and you'll have so much wisdom, and you also will have seen so much of what humanity looks like. You'll become not just an expert on humanity, but you kind of become humanity itself by just existing for that long.
I think that what some of these books might be pointing to is that the cycle of, birth and death is important for the growing sense of self within society, the adaptation of society to changing conditions, or the adaptation of humans that make up that society to changing conditions. And the third book we read, Dr. Futurity by Philip K. Dick, was a really, really interesting book. But on the surface of it, it actually wasn't about immortality at all. It's about a doctor who steps into a time warp, I guess we could say. He gets warped to the future to a dystopian society where reproduction is rigidly controlled, essentially by a computer. But it takes one person's death to basically start the creation of one new life. And there's some genetic engineering stuff there, as each new one is born, it's supposed to be more adapted than the people who came before it. But there's this idea that you need to have one die in order for one to live, for one to start. And what you get is a culture in this book where the people clamor for death. Like it's a social duty. Like if you're injured, you don't want to get healed. There's no doctors in this society. And that's ultimately what he's giving us, a vision of a society without doctors, because the cultural values say that it's better to die than to live as an injured person. Very interesting book.
One of the quotes that really stuck with me, there's two that really stuck with me, but one is, those to come are more real than those alive today. So yes, we have no doctors because there's no point in healing anyone. This soul cube allows people, it chooses what's the best DNA to continue forward. But they are thinking anyone who's alive right now, it doesn't matter that much because their experiences, and then whether whether their genes continue or they're removed from the gene pool, the result, 100 years in the future, 200 years in the future, 300 years in the future, it only gets sweeter as it goes further and further and further because they're advancing through evolution, through this weird genetics program. They've decided that people who live now do not matter at all. And we see old people on the street and young people with their cars intentionally going to hit them, to kill them out. And the old people are there on purpose because they don't want to live anymore. It's according to them, the people living there, it's utopian. But when you look at it, it just looks like the most dystopian thing ever. And another quote that I thought was very telling about this place was, extinction of the individual for the sake of the future.
What I liked about this society is that ultimately it's a mirror reflecting ourselves. But a warped mirror, a funhouse mirror, like all good sci-fi. The idea that one of the characters vocalizes is that our own society today has a neurotic repression of our own awareness of death. So we do everything we can to keep mortality out of our consciousness. We keep it out of our thoughts. We do not think about it. We do not speak of it. But I think that, the book doesn't say this, but I think that actually ties in really nice to all of these stories that exist about immortality. Because when you have a society that refuses to speak about death, I think that it allows free reign for people to fantasize about living forever, to overcome it, and it makes it so that, we can't rationally come to terms with the limited nature of life. So therefore we have to constantly be thinking about any way out. Is there some way out? And we fantasize it and generate these stories to explore that thought.
And this is the horror, I think, that we saw in The Immortal by Jorge Luis Borges, and also The Promise. There's this society that they're all immortal. It's a legend, but it seems that they just never die. We have one character who decides to go. He goes into this crazy labyrinth. He sees them, and it's just people on the shore just eating snakes, doing nothing. One's been in a pit forever. And it's horrifying because they've been alive for so long, they can kind of live every life. They cease to exist as individuals. They just become a loop of many, 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 many different individuals. So one character he meets, of course, is Homer. And it's Homer who has apparently written the Iliad maybe more than once. So here, you might end up reliving your own life or someone else's life many, many, many times, and you just don't really exist anymore. But for him, as he's going to find a way to escape this, he now looks for the river that you drank that gives you back mortality. And when he gets that idea of, I can go back into humanity, I no longer will be this person who sits for 70 years without feeling hunger or caring about anything. I will have the power of life by pursuing death, which is a very contradictory impulse in this story. But I think it was quite interesting that he needs to go after mortality again to feel human again.
I like the story because it reminds me of the Greek myth of Tithonus. So, the goddess Aurora basically asks Zeus to make her lover, the mortal prince Tithonus, immortal. And, if he's immortal, then he could be with her forever. But, Zeus is kind of a trickster. He's kind of an SOB sometimes. So what he does is he makes Tithonus immortal, but he doesn't give him longevity. He doesn't give him health. So what he essentially does is he keeps aging physically. He just can't die. So he's just this crumpled shell of a person at like 200 or 300 years old. It just horrible, horrible stuff. But the connection I want to draw here is that in this Borges story, they retain their bodily youth, and yet you get the sense that mentally they are aging mentally. Their capacities are slipping. The world is becoming a wash. He says it feels like they're living an experience where there's no more objects in the world. It's just this stream of impressions and feelings and sensations, but nothing is stable because they've just lived to see objects come and go and fade away and crumple to dust. And, when he finally does drink from the river of mortality again, ooh, spoilers, sorry, but he is described as a person who has lived in so many places that he's like stitching languages together in really awkward ways. So like he'll have a dialogue with someone and use like 4 or 5 different languages in one paragraph, and people kind of understand him, but there's a sense in which he's hyper fluent and worldly. And in another sense, it says he sounds kind of ignorant just because he can't really do language anymore.
Constance had a really good comment on this episode. She said, so if a human survival is never in jeopardy, do you think their brains would still react to cues of danger, or would it eventually shut down that function? She says that would leave a big hole in terms of stimuli, wouldn't it? I think that's an interesting question because, Borges's stories are often, again, an impossible labyrinth for you to think about. But what would happen if you were around so long? Would you not just lose interest in things, but would different biological functions, if they just don't have any purpose anymore, would they start to atrophy? So to the point where if you really do feel hungry, you should go and eat something. But if you can't die, would hunger just become an emotion that you can completely control? I think that was an interesting thing to consider in this story. And I think that's where we come to our final book, Time Enough for Love by Robert A. Heinlein, where we have Lazarus Long. He's lived for, I think, 2,000 years, and then he lives even further after that. And we meet him when he's pretty disinterested in life because he's just been around so long, he's done everything. They are trying to get him interested in life again by asking him to tell his stories. And he keeps saying, I don't really want to do that. Then they start asking him to get involved or to live other kinds of life. They have all these different options for him. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try living this way? But when he starts telling his story, he gets interested again in who he was. And so do the people around him.
This book was really interesting to me just because it has, I'm going to say selfish, but I don't mean selfish in like pejorative sense, but it has a very like egocentric view of what do people get up to, after such a long time. And I think that it was really interesting, this world that Heinlein presented us, where you have one person who has lived for thousands of years and is essentially like the father of, or the descendant of, or perhaps even a clone of a ton of people who are living in the galaxy right now. Like everyone is his family. Everyone is directly related to him in a really weird way. And yet because he's lived so long, he can do these financial schemes that, in life, you live 100 years, probably a lot less than that, but you get only a few shots to really do something to try to make money. You know what I mean? To invest in something or build something. But for him, it's not like he's going to run out the clock. You know what I mean? He can invest in that. He can invest in this, and he can just wait 500 years and just build up mountains of cash. So you have this godlike individual roaming the universe. And I don't know how to describe this book, but I feel like the monstrous egocentrism that's presented there is probably the most accurate reflection of what a truly existing immortal would be like.
I agree completely. I mean, this is a very overrated and very underrated book. I think some of the ideas of what immortality, people love it and people hate it, but he's got a really interesting, and they're all right, interesting idea of immortality here, because Lazarus Long, he even says, I'm a solipsist. And we see that. He's the progenitor of 85% of the population. So you're right. Everyone that he meets is his family. And he can see sometimes facial features of himself on other people that he's never met before. That's very strange. I think earlier when we were talking about the Boat of a Million Years, the fetishizing of living forever or being able to contain history now is the fetish of yourself, preserving yourself forever. And in Dr. Futurity, where they can control DNA, they can control genetics, here it seems to be just Lazarus Long is this natural phenomenon. However, he is now creating or at least controlling all of genetics. So no matter where he goes, everything is a mirror. Everyone that he meets is him. And he starts having these kind of weird fantasies, they're not even fantasies. They are real relationships throughout as he meets different people, but it's always really just a relationship with himself. So I think that is the kind of weird, really crossing a line of what does immortality really mean? It's I'm so in love with myself, I never want to see myself stop.
All right, Bob, if you had to recommend one of these books to someone who is interested and you thought there was one that is probably the best place to start, what would you recommend?
I love the Borges story. Second time I've read it. So this time I want to actually recommend Book of Skulls because I had never heard about that until Chris recommended it. And wow, Book of Skulls really blew me away. The writing style is fantastic. The idea just keeps you on the edge of your seat completely. And it's philosophical throughout. I mean, yes, it's for college kids who are always, threatening to beat each other up, whatever. What they say is so interesting. And the changes that they go through thinking about their death, thinking about living forever, and thinking about killing each other. These psychological changes that they go through was incredible. I'd highly recommend Book of Skulls. What about you, Zach?
Well, Book of Skulls, I agree with you, was the biggest surprise of what we read. Mm-hmm. I do think if you haven't read it, Borges, The Immortal, it's short, it's sweet, and it's disturbing and visceral in a really interesting way. I think it's not the fairy tale that people want from an immortality story. It's not the happily ever after. It's the idea that if you do become immortal, you'll be clamoring for your own death. I thought that was probably the best presentation of some of the larger overall themes that we saw in all of the books, but in the smallest, most compact and, just aesthetically lucid package of all. So I'd go Borges.
Yes, I think the Borges one... The Borges one really is important. I mean, it shows us if we're clamoring constantly to never die, what are we going to miss out on? It's just going to make our life distended. If we're so obsessed with ourselves and we don't even enjoy the current life that we have, it's going to be just living forever in a pit and losing the meaning of the people around you too, because they lose any pity, they lose any emotions for anyone around them. They forget. I think that's the true vision of if you force your life forever.
Well, I'm so glad that we read all these books. And honestly, I feel like we could just keep going on this topic because I'm sure there's plenty more. If any listeners are watching, if anyone's watching right now and has any recommendations for us, if we were to return to this topic, or for other people who are watching and, you feel like actually there's this other book that is the best book that explores immortality, by all means, leave it in the comments and shoot. I'll talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.